Hello, and welcome to the learning series titled Learning Together, Emergency Shelters and Substance Use Facilities. We're pleased to offer French simultaneous interpretation for this session. If you wish to hear the voice of the interpreter, please select French from the interpretation menu at the bottom of your Zoom screen. Please note this session is being recorded. If you need support at any time during the webinar, you can reach out to one of our producers using the chat feature. My name is Lindsay Yarrow, and as the Senior Improvement Lead on this program, I'm happy to be joining you today as the co-host for our webinar. I'd like to start by acknowledging that we're meeting on land that has been inhabited by Indigenous people since the beginning. In particular, I acknowledge that I'm hosting this webinar from Kingston, Ontario, which is the traditional and unceded territory of the Haudenosaunee and Anishinaabe peoples. We recognize and deeply appreciate their historic connection to this place and the opportunity to gather here today. At Healthcare Excellence Canada, we continue on our learning journey and commitment to support improvement with and for all people in Canada. Healthcare Excellence Canada is an organization with a relentless focus on improving healthcare with and for everyone in Canada. Launched in March 2021 from the amalgamation of the Canadian Patient Safety Institute and the Canadian Foundation for Healthcare Improvement, Healthcare Excellence Canada has greater capacity to support partners to turn proven innovations into widespread and lasting improvements in patient safety and all dimensions of healthcare excellence. We believe in the power of people and evidence and know that by connecting them, we can achieve the best healthcare in the world. Healthcare Excellence Canada is an independent, not-for-profit charity funded primarily by Health Canada. We're pleased to share that this program is delivered in partnership with the Canadian Centre on Substance Use and Addiction and the BC Patient Safety and Quality Council. Today, I'm joined by my co-host, Ryan McCarthy, from the Canadian Centre of Substance Use and Addiction. Ryan, I'm going to hand it over to you for introduction.
Thank you, Lindsay, and hello, everyone. I'm Ryan McCarthy, and I'm the Director of Knowledge Mobilization with the Canadian Centre on Substance Use and Addiction. And I'm pleased to introduce you to our speaker for today's event, Ivy Bourgeau from the University of Ottawa. Ivy, I will turn it over to you to introduce yourself.
Thanks so much. I really appreciate the invitation to speak. So there are a couple of different hats that I wear today. It's mainly the University of Ottawa research chair that I hold in gender diversity and the professions. And so I really appreciate the opportunity to speak with you today about a project that we did on mental health in the workplace. And this is particularly salient now, isn't it? Even though our workplaces have changed remarkably during the pandemic. So this was a specific project that we undertook applying an intersectional sex and gender lens to create a toolkit that we have available online and the process by which we created a set of videos to accompany that. So on the next slide, I provide a little bit of background about the impetus for the project. Because when we first started, I think people had an idea that if they had a gender neutral approach, that would be fair to everybody, equal. And equal is not necessarily equitable. And if you're taking a gender neutral approach, you're not taking into consideration some really important features. And so just to start first, we all of the partners around the table, and I'll describe who they are in a moment, agreed that the workplace where we spend most of our time and increasingly more so can generate positive mental health in that, we have colleagues, we have social support, but it could also be a source of stress and psychological difficulties and also ill health. So it is that kind of double-edged sword. In essence. And so when you look at mental health at work or workplace mental health, or what we refer to as psychological health and safety at work, these are heavily influenced by sex and gender. And to kind of tease apart, and we'll talk about that a little bit, sex being the more biological aspects and gender being the more sociological overlay onto those aspects. And this is a quote that I'm often quoted as saying is, I can't think of two things that are more gendered or more influenced by gender than mental health, which is imbued with impact on terms of sex and gender, and work. Work is highly segregated by gender. And so if you aren't taking an explicit sex and gender lens, and we went further in terms of taking an intersectional sex and gender lens on workplace mental health, we felt that you were, doing this in a way that was ignoring really, really important factors. So we wanted to say we need to recognize this explicitly, both from a manager supervisor perspective, but also from coworkers and from workers themselves, and that it was important to help build capacity to support each other's mental health at work, understanding all of those layers of influence. So on the next slide, I'll talk a little bit about this partnership that was undertaken, because our partnership that we held with folks in Health Canada and the Public Health Agency of Canada was one of 5 or 6, and I think that they've had a couple more partnerships between the Canadian Institute of Health Research, so the national research funding body, and specifically their Institute of Gender and Health, and a partnership with Health Canada and the Public Health Agency of Canada. So our project was one of those which looked at mental health in the workplace. And it was in partnership with our colleagues in Health Canada that we opted to create a toolkit. And at the conclusion of our partnership, we opted to create a video series for that as well. And so the purpose of these partnerships was to bring sex and gender expertise into the government, specifically Health Canada and the Public Health Agency of Canada, to build expertise in our project around workplace mental health and building capacity. And so the multi-section toolkit that we created out of this is available online. Our partners in Health Canada and Public Health Agency of Canada, they have translated that, but an earlier version. So we've updated it, and a translated version will be available on our website. And we've also created the accompanying video series. Almost all, with the exception of one video, is available. They are in English, but they are in the process of being properly subtitled in French. You can automatically subtitle them in French, but we want to make sure that the subtitling is high quality. So we are still in the process of doing that. So that gives a little bit of background about our partnership. So just to take a step back on our next slide is to kind of understand, what do we mean by SGBA? And then we said SGBA plus, and that was in part to take into consideration that in the interim between developing these SGBA partnerships between CIHR and Health Canada, Public Health Agency of Canada, the government of Canada moved towards what they called GBA plus, sort of a gender-based analysis plus. And so we wanted to continue to recognize the importance of sex because the biological had a lot of impact on mental health. And so we didn't want to lose that interplay between sex and gender. We thought that was important, but we also wanted to recognize that we were going beyond simply sex and gender. We were looking at the whole sort of intersectional lens, sort of building on the theoretical perspective from Kimberly Crenshaw that looked at the intersection of gender and race, that we were looking at the intersection of sex and gender and a variety of different elements, whether that was around sexuality, around racialization, around Indigenous identity, around ability. And so we took not all of these intersections. So this is a graphic that was created subsequent to our work, so available on the CIHR Institute of Gender and Health website. But we wanted to focus particularly because of the importance of work on the key employment equity groups plus sexual orientation. So, so just to kind of clarify, Sex and Gender-Based Analysis Plus is an application of critical questions to uncover similarities and differences in the experiences of different identity groups. But it's not just a comparison, it's trying to really understand the intersection of all of the different identities that we have and the impact on workplace wellness. So it goes beyond an SGBA lens with the plus, goes beyond single identities to include a variety of different intersections. So just really wanted to kind of highlight that, because what was very interesting is when we were working with our partners, there was some very clear lack of a clarity in terms of what that was. These terms would get said and they really needed, so just explain to us and provide us with a glossary. So in the next set of slides, I'm going to talk about how we opted to build this toolkit, because we wanted to, again, really base that in the literature and what we knew, based it in knowledge. So our first information source was a review of the literature. This wasn't just scoping review or a systematic review. It was a very specifically, purposefully targeted review of the literature to develop resources to help people understand and apply it. So there were some key sex and gender-based analysis issues and trends in the mental health and workplace wellness literature. And although we did find some important gaps in the literature, it did show that there were clear gender differences in issues like, for example, work-life balance, workplace stress, the effects of different stressors on people who have different gender identities, bullying and harassment, for example. So we wanted to kind of tease those issues out so that when I make a case that there are no two things more gendered than mental health in the workplace, we needed to bring some key literatures to that. So that was one of our initial information sources. Our second information source on the next slide are interviews that we did, because we were creating a toolkit to be used. And so we needed to understand the users of the toolkit and where they were starting and where they wanted to get to, and what would be the approach to get them from point A to point B. And so initially we had talked with our partners and they wanted a literature review, and we talked about, well, is a literature review going to be useful? Are people going to read a literature review? Why don't we have really high level information? And then if people want to dig deeper, we would provide them with hyperlinks to really high quality resources. And I was working with a really wonderful team of research associates that had a really good sense of identifying high quality literature. So our additional information sources were with a senior level staff to obtain information about how it is that they were going to adopt this. And what were the policy facilitators, enablers, and barriers to the adoption of the knowledge that we were generating in the toolkit. So we did interviews, so sort of key informant stakeholder interviews with senior level staff to understand what the gaps were in their understanding of just the quantitative data, so sex disaggregated quantitative data around mental health in the workplace, and to garner from them some ideas about ways to influence the dissemination and uptake of the materials that we were producing in this toolkit. So because it was really a form of knowledge exchange. So we took as our sort of framework, sort of the knowledge to action model. The third source was really getting at, again, additional users. So not just those in leadership positions, but those who were, the workers and co-workers, and in some cases, managers. So we held focus group with different employees in different locations. So it wasn't just federal government employees in Ottawa or the National Capital Region, but different dispersed groups. And I mean, we conducted all of this prior to the pandemic, but we were utilizing many sort of, Zoom distance resources. And so we wanted to understand what the status of their knowledge needs were. And what we found from those conversations, because we had a draft toolkit, and then we said, oh, we're going to have to go back to the drawing board with some elements of this. So it's always important to kind of test whatever knowledge translation tool you're developing, and refine and finesse that. So the focus group said they had difficulty making a link between sex and gender and workplace mental health. So we needed to be clear about that. They suggested to us ways to address that lack of knowledge. So how to approach. So what was the level? So that we had multiple levels so that we would engage people who were at a very novice level, really had very little background, to those who had greater background. So really pitching to that audience was really important. They suggested better provision of supports for mental health and stress, and they confirmed what we were getting both from the literature and from our conversations with our stakeholders, that the managers and supervisors were a particularly important audience for us to kind of pitch the toolkit at managers. It meant that coworkers and colleagues and the employees themselves could look at this, but that it was really important that this toolkit really be focused on managers. So those were all of the sources of data that we brought into creating this toolkit. So on the next slide, I just give a little bit of an overview that we call it the SGBA Plus and Workplace Mental Health Toolkit. Now, keeping in mind, although we developed this with a public service employee group in mind, when we went to do the videos, we wanted to make sure that it was accessible to a variety of different workplaces. So just to give you a sense of what the toolkit actually looks like. So it's, they are resource sheets. So they are text-based, and now we have the video-based. They contain sections on special topics on mental health and psychological well-being, with explicit considerations for men, women, and people with diverse gender identities. So we really wanted to move beyond a gender binary. It's envisioned as providing support to departments, managers, employees, and their families, and services designed to help employees. So one of the other parts of our partnership was to work with an employee assistance program, employee assistance service, so that it was important that when you're seeking professional help through counselors, that they are reinforcing this information, because there's a variable level of acknowledgement of the importance of sex and gender on workplace mental health. And though we finished the toolkit in February of last year, and then of course the pandemic happened. And as we were thinking about developing videos, because we thought, some people will engage with this, they're very text savvy. So when you're in the public service, you're dealing with a lot of documents. So you are, working with text. But then we thought for some people, and again, making it much more accessible outside of the public service, we were moving towards a video format. And so in the process of doing that, we said we have to include something about, at least initially, what the impact of the COVID pandemic was. And so our toolkits are updated as of the end of August of last year in terms of the literature. So we don't have, explicit sections on COVID, but we started to kind of identify what was going on. So in the next slide, I provide sort of a little visual about the different components of the toolkit. So we have an overview video that makes the case. Why do we need to take sex and gender-based analysis plus and mental health into consideration? So we make a case for the toolkit. we describe what is an SGBA plus lens, and then we add that on to the concept of intersectionality and an intersectional lens. We talk a bit high level about sex, gender, and mental health at work. And then in that overview, we provide a glossary, so with definitions, all hyperlinked to the original sources. And we have additional references and resources for people who would like to know more. So again, trying to pitch it for those who just wanted a quick read or those who would like to do a little bit more of a deep dive. And then in partnership with our colleagues at Health Canada and the Public Health Agency of Canada, we identified these 5 topic areas to do a little bit more of a deeper dive. So we started first of all with workplace stress and mental health. And then we focused on work-life balance. We looked at workplace discrimination, diversity and bias, harassment and bullying. And then our 5th one is stigma, disclosure of mental health or a workplace mental health issue, and ways to go about help seeking. So in the next 5 slides, I'm just going to give you a high-level overview of each of those. So starting first with our workplace stress and mental health. Now, remember what our focus groups had identified, the types of information that they would find really helpful. So this became the sections of the toolkit. And originally it was to be a paper-based toolkit on legal size paper to be included in an actual paper-based toolkit that would be disseminated. And that has been something that our partners were starting to do until everybody started working virtually. And then we said, well, we need to make sure that this is online. So, so each of these sections was difficult for us to get within a page and to keep the font big enough. But so we have a little bit of flexibility now with something online. So in this one on workplace stress and mental health, we talked first about the link between mental health and workplace stress. Then we talked about psychological risk factors in the workplace. So again, really making that linkage. And then we got into what are the diverse experiences of workplace stress and mental health by the different intersections, by gender identity, sexuality, being racialized, being Indigenous, living and working with a disability. And then recognizing, so these are some high level, so this matters. And then because it matters, here are some promising practices. So the toolkit is really about what to do, promising practices that help address those SGBA plus elements of workplace stress and mental health. We added a section specifically on the impact of the pandemic by some, not every intersecting identity, but some high level ones that we could find. And then our colleagues at Health Canada, Public Health Agency of Canada, suggested that we have a vignette. And these vignettes would, in some cases, it would be something that we could pull from the experiences that were shared in our focus groups. And some of it was based on their experiences doing workplace wellness programs. And so this is just an excerpt, and we tried to make sure that the vignettes were diverse. And in the video, we made sure that this was a different voice and that the voice was represented by the person who was in this. So all of these QR codes, will link you up to specific video and the toolkit. So this one video or vignette excerpt, Annie Bish is an Indigenous woman who works in the Canadian government. Recently, she's been finding her manager's expectations to complete time-consuming tasks too tight. The deadlines are becoming too much. These expectations are coupled with some comments from her manager that she thinks are funny, but which Annie Bish finds denigrating and insulting to her Indigenous identity. So that's one element of our toolkit. So the next one looks at work-life balance, and I'll just go through quickly some of the high levels. So we get a definition, we get some Canadian data on that, then we get into diversity data our promising practices, and then a section on COVID. And we have, this was actually the very first video that we did. And so this video excerpt is about Samir, who also works at Government of Canada, and about the pressures that he has, in his cultural community in terms of expectations to take care of parents. And so that's represented in this video. The next one we worked on was workplace discrimination and bias. Again, we have some key definitions at the outset. Everything is put into the glossary. We get into diverse experiences. And in this one, we wanted to make sure that it's not just discrimination in and of itself, which is problematic, but that the link between discrimination and mental health. And so to make that really clear. So we wanted to take that extra step in this particular toolkit. Then we have some promising practices, and many of those, drew upon, there's legislation that we need to respect. And so informing people of the legislation, but also what might be some promising practices, both locally, within Ottawa or within Ontario in Canada, and there are also some international examples. Again, many things with hyperlinks, and we have our edition of COVID. Our vignette here is Jada, a Black bisexual woman who works in a lab as a scientist, and the complexities that she's experiencing. And I should have mentioned that following each of the vignette, we have this kind of text box in the toolkit and a section in the video where we have managers sort of pause and reflect on the vignette, on those circumstances, and to think about applying what it is that they learned in the toolkit, the promising practices that they should take into consideration in terms of moving forward. So that's the workplace discrimination and bias one. Our next one gets at issues of harassment and bullying. And you'll probably anticipate that there's an overlap between these, which there are, but we wanted to make sure that we were bringing in distinct resources into the toolkit for each of the components. So again, definitions of workplace harassment and bullying, the impact of how that is experienced by different groups, and again linking that to mental health, some promising practices that take an intersectional section gender lens, and then how that is being experienced during the pandemic. We have another vignette excerpt around harassment and bullying. And I also want to highlight here in creating the videos, we really worked purposely because the videos are both, they have photos, so still images, they have moving images, so videos, and we wanted that to reflect the content of the experiences, and we wanted that to be representative. And we also did a doodly, sort of a white board part of that, which is actually really quite challenging because when we were doing it last summer, the doodly program was really pretty white. There was not a lot of diversity. So we had to incorporate a lot of different images into the doodly. So you'll notice that not all of them are actual whiteboard art. So we have on our in the image here, some of the issues that reflect the content of the toolkit. And the last one is on stigma, disclosure, and help seeking on the next slide. And this one, we don't have our video done as of yet, so this will be released soon. It has a similar format. What do we mean by stigma, disclosure, and help seeking? And so it had those three overlay. There was, for this one, we wanted to take an explicit focus on transgender employees. So we created a separate text box because the vignette that we were using and the initial vignette that we did, because we didn't have a lot of input for people from a transgender background into the focus groups, the initial vignette was particularly problematic. And before we were going to invest resources into creating a video, I wanted to make sure that we ran the excerpt by folks. We did that also with the one with Anabish. We made sure that we were presenting in a way that felt really authentic to someone who is Indigenous, and that we were using terminologies that were really considered appropriate. So sometimes the people that did the voice work also did a bit of cultural safety and humility checking for us as well. We ended up completely redoing the vignette in this case because of a connection that we made as a team, and really heard from different transgender folks how the vignette was problematic. And so we rewrote it, we passed it by them, and they said, yes, we are comfortable with this. And we had someone who wasn't named Valerie, but that was her pseudonym that she chose, that did the voiceover for this. So I just want to pause. So Valerie is a transgender woman who works in a policy department in the federal government. A while ago, she decided to affirm her gender identity by undergoing transition. The way that she explained that to us is she feels good about that decision. That's not what was causing stress. What was causing stress was everybody's reaction to it, and people feeling uncomfortable and doing sort of microaggressions, inappropriate terms, and that sort of thing. But it was really important to say that the mental health concerns was from the reaction, not from the transition. The transition was a very positive element. So I'm really, really looking forward to that video being out and having feedback from folks. So those are the 5 elements of the toolkit. And so in the next slide, I just want to kind of give you some high-level highlights of what we learned through this process, because there were many, many lessons learned. So first is that we can't assume that people know what you already know about sex and gender. And because some of this seems quite apparent for us, but that's not everybody has those experiences. So it can be difficult to incorporate. You're asking people to unpack years of socialization into a sex and gender system. And then when you overlay that on top of a system around racialization and colonization, and it's really a lot to unpack. And so this toolkit is just a step in that process of doing it. A toolkit approach can help build capacity to better promote and manage and support mental health, recognizing a sex and gender lens. And our hope is that employees will be better equipped to be much more respectful and inclusive of each other. So we want to move from equity, diversity to inclusion. And an account of the toolkit's design is an example of how a policy partnership can really be helpful. So there's a lot of transferability of what we learned just by doing the partnership beyond just this particular topic of sex and gender-based analysis in workplace wellness. So we are, this is part of our dissemination, our knowledge transfer of the toolkit, and I'm hoping to do associated education with that. Just a couple of more slides. Next one is a bit of a testimonial from the generator of the policy partnership, Dr. Kara Tannenbaum, who's the scientific director of the Canadian Institutes of Health Research Institute of Gender and Health. And I love how she says, so these videos are a must-see for all employers and employees working during the COVID pandemic. And I like how she says, told from a personal identity-based perspective, the clips offer practical stress reduction recommendations for individuals from diverse cultural backgrounds using evidence-based sex and gender plus analyses. And she says she's learned a lot and she's already putting them to good. So that was great. So the last slide is just to thank you. I'm really excited to engage with you and your comments and questions. And this is, again, just a hyper link to the toolkits. And they are in the process. So the updated toolkits are being translated. So we're building on the translations that our colleagues in Health Canada and Public Health Agency of Canada did with the initial iteration, the February 2020 version. And we will also be making sure that the subtitles for the videos will be of high quality. So we're looking forward to that. So thanks, and I'll pass it back to the moderators.
Thanks so much, Ivy, for sharing with us not only the toolkit, but your journey to build this toolkit and where you're at on that journey. We'd like to open it up now for questions that we can pose to Ivy. So feel free to include any comments or questions that you have in the chat box. If you do feel more comfortable reaching out to a member of your team, and as the moderators, we'd be happy to ask those questions to Ivy. Please reach out directly to Jessica Hodge in either official language, and she will pass those along to Ryan and myself. So we'll give folks a moment to engage in that chat box. Maybe Ryan, I'll start by handing it off to you for any questions or reflections you might have.
So Ivy, I was interested when you started this work and you were having the discussions and the key informant interviews with senior managers. Did they understand or identify that the sex and gender-based analysis was an important part? So did you have to get buy-in from them, or were they already on board and really just wanted to help further identify the issues and help address them?
Yeah, that's a really, really important question. I would say for the most part, the people that we interviewed had buy-in. And in fact, some of them were really champions of this. And some were a little bit more reluctant, let's say, because, this was coming, in part, from top down. There might have been, some issues sort of bubbling up, from the grassroots employees and different initiatives that were ongoing. But this was largely that every minister's mandate letter, included a statement on, incorporating a sex and gender-based analysis. And then that got permeated through the system. So, but by and large, and we had incredible colleagues to work with, as with everything, because, we started initially, it was supposed to be sort of a one-year project, but some of our team or some of our partners were more ahead of the curve in getting started, some were less. And so there was a bit of delay in that. So some of our work got extended. There was additional funds that were provided, so we were able to extend some of the work. Our particular partnership had two different streams to it. So we started working with one stream. This particular toolkit came out of work with our subsequent stream. And so there was a bit of, as there always is in government and probably also with pan-Canadian health organizations, some turnover of key folks. So that means that you have to kind of start, not from scratch, but to kind of get everybody on board again. And so there is definitely some of that, but we wanted to create something that would live beyond our partnership. And that would be something that, we've opted to update it, but our partners within Health Canada and Public Health Agency of Canada, they can also update it and make it, more relevant to other ongoing initiatives that we're doing. We've let them know of the updates that we've done. So I think that that's a good question, but we did have a lot of buy-in from some and others were more hesitant. Yeah.
Ivy, for those folks who were more hesitant, did you hear from the focus group or your own experience how you could support that process of change and understanding? And I know I've watched the videos, you target a bit of that, understanding why this is important for organizations to consider. But could you share a bit more about that?
Yeah, we wanted to pitch the toolkit initially and the videos in a way that this became we need to do this. And so to make it accessible and to make it doable, right? Because, and also acknowledging that everybody's in a different path on a journey, and everybody comes to that path with different identities. And so we wanted to say, you know, we all need to undertake this work. And it's interesting also to say that, you know, these are, so mental health is a very taboo issue to talk about. I mean, we're talking about mental health more so than we have in this last, you know, 18 months than we have for probably the, you know, previous 18 years. So I think that we're getting at the issues that are a bit taboo. Talking about sex and gender and sexism and racism, these are all hot button issues. And so we wanted to kind of create some sense of safety in that for everybody, recognizing that everybody, again, has a different identity and different experiences about that. And we wanted to just move everybody forward in a positive way, and to give them, you know, I wouldn't say quick and easy, because none of this is quick and easy, but to give them some things that they could work on, some tangible, pragmatic things that they can work on, and why that is important. The section on microaggressions, I think, was really, we got a lot of feedback on that, because I think that there was genuine ignorance, you know, a lack of realization that these things are really inappropriate. And so they were inappropriate things to be said from a sex and gender lens, or inappropriate things to be said, you know, for folks who are trans, inappropriate things to say if you're Indigenous. There are so many terms that are so pejorative and culturally laden that have just been said that they become almost rote, that we just wanted people just kind of pause and reflect and go, oh, I hadn't thought of that. It's not my intention to be offensive. I mean, recognizing some people do intend to be offensive, but by and large, let's, you know, keep it all on. It's to be positive for everybody. So just to kind of give them some very concrete what hurts and what helps, we thought would be really good.
Another question that came up for me while we're waiting for some more questions in the chat room was around people sharing their stories with lived and living experience, because I think the examples really help highlight the areas that you've identified in the toolkit. How did you go about identifying those people to share their stories and making sure that they were doing so in a safe way, that there would be no repercussions given that they are in the federal public service and that it does become more of a public issue for them to share?
Yeah, absolutely. So I would say most of the vignettes are a compilation of experiences. Some of that was shared in the context of the focus groups. Everybody signed a consent form, and they were told that they could share whatever they felt willing to share, that we might put some of those excerpts into different forms. We weren't sure how we were going to do that at that point. But we made sure that nobody's particular story was identifiable. So it really is a congregate of different stories that were shared with us in the focus groups and were shared with our partners, you know, who were operating sort of a center for, you know, mental health and respect in the workplace. The last story that was shared, again, it wasn't so much sharing her personal story as her reflections on the vignette that we had created, that was created by, again, in the same process that the other one was created, but again, we didn't have trans folks in our focus groups to share that, or if they were trans, they didn't identify as such, again, because, you know, some of it we did virtually. But yeah, so she shared her reflections and what would be an improvement. So again, like many vignettes, they are an integration of a variety of different stories. So there isn't one person's stories that we would necessarily have to protect, but we wanted to include in those stories a variety of different elements that would highlight what we were saying previously in the toolkit and what would be something that would be a point of an action that would be needed by a manager, or something that they would have to reflect on and go back into the toolkit and kind of look at, well, what would be a better way to do that? We were asking them to sort of pause and reflect on it. And so although many of the vignettes were created, again, with our partners in mind, you know, a federal government office, I suspect that many people who are working in different settings could see themselves in those vignettes, or elements of themselves in those vignettes. And I mean, there were parts, you know, for example, in the vignette, I'm not Black, of course, but the gender elements of some of the stories for our vignettes for women who are Black employees, I can relate to that. And that's also really helpful, is for you to relate to some element of that story. You know, for Valerie, the trans woman, I can relate to the experience of microaggression, so I could imagine, and you could, you know, put yourself in the shoes. And that's what we really wanted to kind of challenge people to do with the vignettes. So yeah, thank you for that question.
Ivy, we've had a question come through for the audience, and I'm going to read out. Any advice on building a psychologically safe workplace on an organizational level?
Oh, that's an excellent question. And one of the way that we framed this work initially is that we said there's work that individuals can do as employees, as colleagues, and as managers, right? So there are individual level knowledge that you can gain and understanding. There's work within the team and how a team can create psychological health and safety, and then building out from there the organization. And then we also put that in sort of a broader system societal level. So for example, you know, on a more system societal level, you know, we are talking more about mental health and substance use. We are and that's sort of happening, you know, because of work like the Mental Health Commission, like the Canadian Centre on Substance Use and Addiction. So really trying to kind of, from a societal level, destigmatize that so that we can acknowledge that that's what we're experiencing. And so the organization is at that very interesting interplay between what's happening societally and then what's happening, you know, individually and within teams. And so the organizational level, which is the reason why our stakeholder interviews and also the folks in the focus groups had said, if you focus on managers, because managers play a really important role, not just in the team, but also in an organization, to really embed this in different structures within the organization, so that it's not just an interpersonal thing, but that it gets embedded in the system. So when we talk about that, there's systemic sexism, there's systemic racism. So how is that embedded in organizational systems, and to reflect on having a much more explicit intersectional lens when you adjust and you know, work in an anti-sexist and anti-racist way. So the organizational level is a really, really important point, you know, for intervention. And we're hoping that elements of the toolkit can enable that. But there is definitely an interplay between all of those different levels. Yeah.
One of the things that struck me is the cultural differences between work-life balance. So you mentioned one of the employees that talked about the expectations culturally that they would be taking care of their parents. Can you maybe speak a little more to how to best educate people at an employment level around the work-life balance issue? Because it's a lot more complex and a lot more broad than I think people have kind of contextualized it as.
Yeah, absolutely. And, you know, recognizing that we spend a lot of time at work and everything's been blurred right now, right? And this was the thing, we were pivoting, and we were trying to sort of figure out, you know, what is it that we traditionally knew or know about work-life balance, how that was shifting in this remote work environment, and that, you know, the blurring. was becoming even more so. And I think that people have become much more sensitive to what people's different staff, different employees, colleagues, what their life, their family life situation is. Like whether or not are you living alone? And that has a certain set of concerns. Are you, living with a partner? Is that a good partnership? Are you living, with young children that you have to take care of or homeschool? Are you living with older children? Are you living with older adults? Do you have an extended family? So that had, implications in terms of the pandemic and spread, but it also had implications in terms of where are you going to find a place to work? And we have seen into people's homes more so now than we ever have. It's just really a fascinating intervention, accidental because we didn't plan this type of workplace intervention. But we see what people's homes look like. We see their pets, we see their kids popping in, sometimes your dad, whatever your circumstances are. And I think that there's just more of an acknowledgement of what people's work lives are. Like their home lives are, and how that impacts, on their work. And so there are more accommodations now. So I think that although this work-life balance has been blurred, I think that we have greater acknowledgement because we've had a window for 16 months into those very, very particular circumstances for people. So we can't ignore that now. It'll be interesting how we move back into a hybrid or, mostly, at work or mostly remote, how that's going to have an impact. It was difficult for us to kind of assess that at the, just sort of after the first wave of the pandemic, but it's a really, really interesting set of circumstances, that's for sure.
And it looks like we have time for one last question that's come in, and it actually kind of builds and overlaps on the question Ryan just asked and you were answering. And this is, what considerations need to be addressed in the virtual context in regards to psychological health and safety during the pandemic?
Yeah, absolutely. I think there are a variety of different layers there. I think that individually, some workers do very well. Just from their personality, that they are, very, very focused. They like to work by themselves. And some people really need other people to be around them. They really need those, those inputs for, with others. And whether from a social or just a generative, from a creativity perspective, how do we creatively problem solve? And it's much more formal. Like we have to sort of book a time to kind of meet. Sometimes when people kind of reach out on Teams, and you're just going, why are you contacting me now? We didn't book a time, right? That people have like reduced that flexibility, whereas people used to kind of come by the office and things like that. So it's very interesting. How do we create that flexibility in an online environment? That we used to have. And so I think that this virtual environment, it remains to be seen. We haven't really sort of figured out what have been the impacts, because we've moved to a virtual environment in the context of a pandemic. So it's trying to tease apart what's the impact of the pandemic and the stressors that are related to that, and being concerned about, catching COVID, dying from COVID, your family members, and then all of this overlay of working in a virtual environment. And some of that had to change really, really quickly. And what systems did we have in place and not have in place? But that's typically how change happens. It happens dramatically in these big spurts. And what will be the legacies of that, I think, will be really interesting to see. So virtual environments, will definitely continue. I don't think we're going back to the way that we did things before. There are some things that, you know, we've lost that we might want to regain, but just even little assumptions that we had, for example, when we were doing those pieces on workplace bullying, we're just like, well, there mustn't be any workplace bullying anymore because people aren't in the office to be bullied, right? Well, no, it just transforms, you know, in a different way. You know, getting back to Marshall McLuhan, the medium is the message, right? I mean, you change the medium, you know, the same type of, you know, harassment, it just takes a different form. However, it's a bit more apparent, right? Because there are traces of it. And so there's that, but I don't think we haven't seen the full extent of what this move to virtual impact has had on workplace mental health, and again, controlling for, teasing, parting, or moving beyond the pandemic, which we're very fortunate to be able to say that we can do, given the vaccine rates. We're very lucky there.
Thank you, Ivy. Our next learning event is scheduled for July 15th from 12 to 12:30. This event is a huddle focused on harm reduction and virtual overdose prevention line, which supports individuals who use substances. So we invite all our audience to join us then. And our webinar following that will be July 27th. A very special thank you to Dr. Ivy Bourgeau for today's presentation. Thank you, Ivy, and for answering our many questions as well. Please be sure to take a few moments to complete the feedback polls on your screen. So we're going to pull those up. I'll read through what those look like. I know more about the SGBA Plus toolkit than I did before the webinar, and that's from strongly agree to strongly disagree. Overall, I was very satisfied with my webinar experience. Again, strongly agree to strongly disagree. And our last poll question for you to answer is, I'll be able to apply what I learned from this webinar in my work. And again, strongly agree to strongly disagree. So please click submit to share your poll answers with us. Thank you again, everyone. Thank you, Ivy, and goodbye for now.